I love Miriam's song. I love Miriam's song for a bunch of reasons. One of them is that Miriam is a woman, and she has a song in parts of the Old Testament where there just aren't a lot of women's words, right? So the clergywoman in me is like, go Miriam. Also, it is one of the oldest fragments of scripture in the Hebrew scriptures. Folks who study the evolution of language date it to probably 10 centuries before Jesus' birth, whereas much of the rest of those stories were written several centuries later. In fact, if you read the full story, which we didn't put all of the reading, all of Exodus 14 and 15 in the reading today because it's really long, there's a song of Moses just before the song of Miriam. That's a newer song. Miriam's was first, right? Go, Miriam. And, you know, when I imagine what it must have been like to realize that they were free and that the army that was pursuing them was no longer coming, you know, this is such a trivial thing, but I remember the first time I saw Star Wars, and when the Death Star blew up, I was like, woohoo! That's only the tiniest sliver of what Miriam must have felt. Go, Miriam, of course, celebrate, shout praise to God. And when I read the story, she's shouting praise to God because the entire Hebrew army, or the Egyptian army has been drowned, as the spiritual says. And I think, I don't, Are we supposed to be celebrating that a whole bunch of people were killed? What do we do with this? This feels to me like so much part of our real life now in the 21st century. This, what do we do with stories that are complicated, which is all stories, really. So I want to dig a little bit more into this text, into this story. And the first thing I want to say is, one of the reasons we didn't read all of Exodus 14 and 15 isn't just the length of it, but it's also really repetitive. If you read through those chapters, and I recommend that to you sometime when you get a chance, my initial response was, wow, they really could have used a good editor. They keep saying the same thing over and over in a little bit different ways. And one of the reasons is they were putting together a bunch of different oral traditions. It was like high school students writing 4 term papers on the same topic and then smooshing them together into one term paper and just kind of interspersing all of the sentences. It gets a little redundant. And they don't all quite agree with each other if you read down through the stories. We often talk about how the Bible isn't a book, it's a collection of books. Some of the books of the Bible, Exodus is one of them, is a collection of a variety of stories. And so if you read through that, it's hard to know exactly what happened historically, because it's not super clear. It's not linear, really. And that's because we don't really know what happened. Mitch was speaking at the kids' message about how the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, was a large, shallow marsh. And there are scholars who think that a strong east wind blowing all night would have pushed the water away enough to expose enough land that lightly laden Hebrew slaves who didn't have a lot of luggage because they were on the run would have gotten across fine. But when the chariots and the horses started to go across that same land, they would have bogged down in the mud. The horses would have sunk into the mud. And then when the wind stopped and the waters rushed back, they were caught and they were drowned. Is that really what happened? We don't know. Did it look like the Disney movie where walls of water went up and you could actually watch the fish swim in the walls of the water? We don't know, right? And one of the Jewish scholars that I read this week said, did Exodus really happen in this way? And then they said, no one knows and no one should presume to know. That is not the point. So that's part of what I want us to hang on to here. I think it's always important for us to remember that if we go to the Bible looking for history like you go to an encyclopedia to look for facts, we're going to be frustrated. We're going to get stuck. We're going to get bogged in quagmire, kind of like Pharaoh's chariots, to be honest. There's a rabbi named Rachel Barenblatt who has a delightful blog called The Velveteen Rabbi. For all of you who grew up on the book The Velveteen Rabbit, we'll get the pun. And she wrote this: whether or not my ancient ancestors were actually slaves to a pharaoh in Egypt, what matters is that I choose each year to retell the story as if it were true. What matters is that I do my best to live Torah's injunction, love the strangers, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. What matters is that I consider myself part of the people who tell this story as a sign of our priority and our identity. We were birthed from slavery, she writes, into, and I love this phrase, into the freedom of uncertainty. The freedom of uncertainty, not the burden of uncertainty or the frustration of uncertainty. We are freed for uncertainty. We were birthed from slavery into the obligation of relationship, who we are and who God is. I'm going to say that again. This story, we tell this story to claim our identity and to claim our priorities. This story tells us about who God is and who we are as God's people. And those of us who are Christians, we are grafted into the house of Israel, after all, and the Jesus whom we follow was a Jewish rabbi. This story is our story, too. And so we retell this story not because we're absolutely certain of the literal facts. We tell this story because of the truth that is in it. This story tells us that God is on the side of the oppressed, and that God puts in motion actions that create freedom. Freedom from structural oppression, freedom from personal oppression. And I know stories, and I know you all know stories in your own lives and the lives of people around you, of miraculous freedom. And we tell this story because it tells us about ourselves. This story reminds us that we need to care for strangers because our ancestors were strangers. And those of us who live in these United States, almost all of us are descended from peoples who did not originate in this continent. We are descended of people who are strangers, and that is some of why we care for strangers. This story reminds us of that. And this story reminds us of what the Velveteen Rabbi calls the obligation of relationship. But what I would say is it reminds us of the joy of relationship. We get to partner with God in freeing and healing the world. That's what this story tells us. The stories we tell and how we tell them matter. This is a dangerous story, this Exodus story. This story is why slave owners did not teach their slaves to read, because they did not want them to read this story in the Bible, because the slave owners in the United States do not come out well being the Pharaoh in this story. We heard one spiritual already today about this story, and we'll sing another spiritual after this sermon. This is a powerful story and has been a powerful story for folks in this country who were enslaved. How we tell stories is dangerous, and that's why there are curriculum battles going on all over the country. It feels to me like part of our growing up as people in the 21st century is our commitment to tell stories in all their fullness, the liberation and the pain and the suffering that created that liberation, both of those things. The Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery project is part of that. Our own acknowledgement of the indigenous land on which this building is located is part of that. The reparations group that spoke earlier in the year this year about how our building, so much of the money for our building came from the textile industry in this country, which received cheap cotton from slave labor in this country. Knowing all of those stories is part of our responsibility, not because it diminishes our joy, but because it tempers it. It helps us to be humble and joyful, both. This last week, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was the 60th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, in which 4 girls were killed and another girl was grievously wounded during the civil rights era in this country. And Ketanji Brown Jackson, our Supreme Court Justice, spoke at that church at the memorial on Friday, I think on Friday. And as she spoke, she talked about how even though she was born after that bombing, so it's a little startling to realize that Supreme Court justices are younger than me, but that's another story. Though she was born after that bombing, her parents made sure she knew that story. Not so that she would feel victimized, not so that she would be downtrodden, but so that she would know the reality of the world that she lived in, right? Her parents also took pains to raise her as a person of joy, as a person who knew her worth and her power, and she is now the first Black woman in the Supreme Court, right? The whole story is an important part of that for her, and she charged folks to tell the whole stories as we do. The Song of Miriam reminds me that knowing the whole story births in me a strength and a resilience and a groundedness in who God is and how God can redeem even the hardest tales. And that God invites me to be part of it. And that's the celebration for me with the Song of Miriam. Wendell Berry writes in the Mad Farmers Liberation Front, "Be joyful though you have considered all the facts." And that is the call that I believe this story offers to us. Not consider all the facts and be depressed because some of them are sad, but consider all the facts and know that we're called to joy and to liberation and to redemption, considering all the facts.